Teach for America is placing a lot of core members in special education at charter schools that have this mission of providing choice and opportunity to students and their parents, but they're not actually providing meaningful choice to these parents or their families.
I want to welcome you to episode 14 of the podcast Truth for America, which gives voice to parents, community stakeholders, and others about their experiences with Teach for America. My name is Julian Vasquez Heilig. I'm a professor of educational policy and leadership at California State University, the Sacramento campus. I'm also here with my co-host.
Hi, I'm Jameson Brewer. I'm a lecturer at the University of Georgia in the Department of Lifelong Education, Administration, and Policy.
Thank you so much. And today we have two folks joining us to talk about Teach for America and special education. We first talked about special education in episode 4 when we interviewed two Teach for America alums who talked about their experiences teaching special ed in the Bay Area. And we have with us Dr. Barbara Paisey, who is a special education professor at the University of Texas at Austin College of Education. And we also have Ian Scott, who is a former TFA teacher from Los Angeles, where he taught special education. He's currently a PhD student in educational psychology at the University of Illinois. And so to get us kicked off today, we're hoping that Ian could just talk about his story.
The first thing I would say is I wish I had something that I could say about my experiences being what I feel is atypical in some way. You know, the lack of training that I received, the inconsistent and often inadequate ongoing support, you know, this pushing of ideologies that treat education as a private good, which we know has a disproportionate effect on students with disabilities, you know, these attempts to control children through harsh and culturally insensitive disciplinary programs, focus on quote-unquote leadership in corporate managerialism, is all things that we've read about and heard about over and over again in places like Cloaking Inequity, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, NPR, and my experience is very much reflective of those experiences as well. And I'm pointing this out at the beginning just because I feel it's important to note that, you know, Teach for America wants to act like my experience is not representative of many core members' experiences, but we see that the evidence is really piling up that this is a fairly normal experience within Teach for America. And so I first was introduced to Teach for America as an undergraduate. I was taking a course with a professor who was in one of Teach for America's first cohorts in New York in the early 90s. And so, you know, brought in a recruiter, you know, allowed a recruiter to come into the class and sort of make the, you know, couple-minute pitch. And, you know, at the time, I was just sort of half listening, you know, ready to get on with the lecture sort of thing. And at the time, you know, didn't really put too much thought in it. But as I was getting ready to graduate and thinking about what my next steps were and what I was planning on doing with myself, Teach for America, at least how I was presented with it, it came across as more of a way to help pay for a credential rather than this sort of, you know, social justice, civil rights rhetoric that they like to attach to their work. Mm-hmm. And so I went into this thinking I wanted to go into teaching. I myself didn't have a super positive experience as a student. I was actually a high school dropout at a very young age. And so wanted to go into education and saw this and had it presented to me as a way of, you know, this is a way to get into education. We help pay for credentialing programs. We help to do all these things. And so that was my initial attraction to it and why I got into it. And then when you show up and they start talking about you being inducted into the core and, you know, all this language of just felt very culty and very, so right away it started to not sit right with me. And I was placed into special education even though my academic background was in political science and political economy, so I never studied developmental psychology, special education, had no training in that front whatsoever. But because I had checked the box on my application that I would be interested in learning about opportunities in special education, I was automatically placed there.
Okay.
And
so did you originally think that maybe you might be teaching social studies or another?
That was sort of the plan. I applied a year earlier and had been placed in Memphis to teach world history and geography, but had to turn it down because my schedule conflicted with the summer training schedule.
Okay.
And so figured same sort of thing would happen, but the second time around was put into special education.
So Ian, tell me a little bit about how Summer Institute went for you. How much training did they give you to teach special ed?
Special education during the actual Summer Institute, I don't recall receiving any specific special education training.
Did they teach you how to write an IEP?
No, I went into my first day as a teacher not knowing how to write an IEP, not knowing, the basics of special education law, not knowing any of these things that, someone needs to be a functioning special education teacher who's actually able to advocate for their students' rights and educational rights. And this is doubly important because the school that I was placed at, for the first semester that I was there, I was the special education department. I was the only special education teacher in the school, and I had no training really in how to do the job that I was assigned to do.
Wow. So how did the administrators of the school respond to the fact that you showed up at their school with basically knowing nothing about special education?
I don't necessarily know that the administrators knew the extent to which I was or was not trained. It was sort of the particular charter school network that I worked with hires a lot of Teach for America teachers for their special education departments.
Oh, really?
And so it just seemed like a fairly normative practice that, they're going to come in and hire a certain number of special education teachers. And it just so happened that at my school, I was assigned to work with another teacher who went, this was not another Teach for America teacher, but she had just finished her credential and master's. And because there was a problem with the contract and getting paid and all that stuff, she resigned within the first 2 weeks of the semester, leaving just me by myself.
So you're telling me that you went into a charter school and they weren't at all concerned that you knew absolutely nothing about special education?
No, I did not get the impression that that was an issue at all.
And you're also saying that this is from your experience, that this was pretty typical, that this charter school would hire lots of TFA teachers that knew nothing about special education children?
Yes, that is correct.
Wow. How many Teach for America teachers did you see, personally, charter schools in Los Angeles?
In the general education areas, that would be harder for me to estimate because I didn't have as much interaction with teachers from other schools. I know at my school, it was a very small number.
Sure.
But in terms of special education, I would say probably close to, if not about half of the special education teachers for this charter network were either current or TFA alum.
Wow. So you're estimating that about half of the teachers you interacted with were Teach for America teachers that had similar experiences to yours, which is that they did not know how to write an IEP. They really didn't know anything about special education students because they didn't have any training on special education going into the class. I want to bring in our special education expert, Dr. Pazey. Is that legal? I mean, is that allowable? How is this happening, Dr. Pazey?
Most people who become special education teachers have, at the very least, opportunities to be able to interact with the process of writing an IEP. Now, it's important to note that no one writes an IEP. The special education teacher does not write the IEP him or herself. It's a team effort. And so the administrator would be involved, the parent the general education teacher, the teacher record, or the special education teacher who is the case manager, any other individuals that might be involved in the education of that child. However, normally the person who leads that meeting is the special education teacher. So here we are talking about the idea of a group of people coming together to look into what is the best interest of the student for his or her education, and the very probably least prepared is the person who is actually supposed to be facilitating or leading that meeting. What concerns me also is that the administrator and the school itself are actually making an agreement that whatever they come up with for that particular IEP is going to be a bonding agreement that you're going to do what needs to be done for that student. So if the person who is teaching special ed doesn't even understand the legalities or the requirements, knows how to make those kinds of connections with the classroom teacher, that is a very sad situation.
So Ian, tell us a little bit about, so how did you lead the IEP meetings? How did that happen for these students?
So I started writing IEPs, a couple weeks into the school year. So we're talking, within a month of the first day of school, there were several, annual IEPs that would come up. And, being the only special education teacher at the school, it was on me to write these IEPs and to lead these meetings. And I did receive some support from some administration at the charter school to sort of help me write these IEPs, help me learn to lead the meetings, reviewed everything for me. But that doesn't negate the fact that I went into this unprepared, and I started this without knowing what I should be doing. And so even if we were sort of able to put this stuff together and to make it work, I shouldn't have ever been in that position in the first place, to have to make it work somehow.
So were the parents of the students in that charter school aware, especially the parents of the special education students, were they aware that you really did not know how to deal with their children until down the road?
No. Nope. I was, presented as just any other teacher, and that was that.
Did you have any idea or understanding that you were supposed to get specific information from the general education teachers and have that information possibly through some sort of work samples or anything, so that they could actually talk about what the present level of performance was for the student, where they were? Did you have any of that kind of understanding? That's the very first thing you do, is determine the present levels of performance of the
Right.
student. And so I was just wondering if you had that kind of information available to you. Did you have a chance to talk to the parents to tell them what they were going to expect? Were all of the individuals that had to be there at the meeting present?
Yes. So going into the start of the school year, I really didn't know a lot of that. There was, like I was saying, a little bit that was done over at the end of the summer. They had a special, at least in Los Angeles, we had about a week of extra training that was provided to us that was very special education specific, and it was provided just to the special education teachers. But it wasn't enough time to go into depth, especially because it still included all of, it wasn't just a week of solid nothing but special education, but also included, the sort of leadership type oriented stuff that Teach for America likes to include in a lot of its professional development.
So basically you're forced to learn on the job. Parents weren't aware, the parents of the students at the charter school weren't even aware that you were learning on the job on their children. They just had no idea. Nobody told them that.
Correct.
And did the parents attend the IEP meetings?
Yes, for the most part, yes.
Yeah, okay.
So I have a question, Barbara. We're talking about IEPs and some of the processes that special education teachers will do on a day-to-day basis, but I'm wondering if you could sort of spell out for our listeners some of the things and some of the training that are really necessary for special education teachers before they even get to their first IEP on the first day?
Okay, so right now, what we're all assuming is that we already have identified the specific student for being eligible for special education. So there is an entire process before they're even identified or determined to be eligible for special education that needs to take place. And that is not just for special education teachers, but general education teachers, as far as how do you determine whether or not a child needs to possibly be tested in the first place. And so obviously, a special education teacher would need to be involved in trying to make sure that everything is done prior to that to provide those types of supports and support the general education teacher. So we're not even talking about that. That's before we even identify the student in regards to eligibility for special ed. And one of the things that Ian said was when he referred to this disciplinary action and kind of a harsh disciplinary action, which causes me some concern because I'm wondering whether or not the student with the disability or student might be showing some challenging behaviors.
Barbara, which disciplinary issue? Was this something that you guys were talking about before the call?
No, he said that he received inconsistent training and that there was this push for the private good of the of the school, but he also talked about how there was a very strong and harsh disciplinary approach and also how they worked with the students, kind of a no excuses approach, I believe would maybe be what he was talking about. And so this issue of discipline and identifying students, making sure that that the IEP might address those types of things. So again, the IEP does not just address academic goals, it also can address specific situations as far as behavior or certain types of social abilities or social skills. So the IEP is much further beyond just the academic needs of the student, because in many cases it might be organization and other ideas. And I have the feeling, based on what Ian is saying, that most of the focus was just on the academic needs of the student. And so you're really going in and doing a holistic picture of the student and supporting that student through his or her IEP goals.
So Ian, I do have a question about this. So, Dr. Paisley was talking about essentially the identification of special education students. And we know in the research literature, as you look across states, that charter schools serve less special education students. Some people have said that has to do with the identification of students. Is there any inside information you can tell us about just what you heard in the hallways about the identification of special education students in your charter school?
At the charter network that I worked at, and most of the charter networks throughout Los Angeles, there is very much a one-size-fits-all approach to special education in that, specifically at my school, it was an inclusion-only program, which I'm sure Barbara can speak more eloquently about issues of predetermination and IEPs and making sure students have access to the least restrictive environment. But when you have a school that basically operates as, we have inclusion and that's it, then any student for whom full general education inclusion is not the appropriate setting is not going to have access to an adequate education at that school. And so from my experiences, in the charter network that I worked in and heard stories similarly from colleagues, that any student who might have a more profound need or might require like a self-contained setting or a different curriculum or anything like that would not have access to those things.
So my question would be, did they do anything, would that be the point where a parent might be encouraged to take their child back to the public school or be encouraged to go elsewhere because of the fact that they might be better served because of the resources that are available?
I never directly heard any sort of counseling out or anything like that.
So, one of the interesting things, we had a debate with a reporter from Education Post early on in the podcast who essentially wrote a piece critiquing the work of Jameson and I on Teach for America. And the piece that she wrote in Education Post after the podcast was that we didn't really want to talk about Teach for America. We wanted to talk about charter schools. Now, one of the interesting things that we were talking about off air before we came on the podcast was that you feel like those two actually are intertwined. Could you talk to us a little bit about your perspectives on this relationship between Teach for America and charter schools in Los Angeles and elsewhere? What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, like I said, being in Los Angeles, it's really hard for me to see Teach for America as being separate from the charter school movement. And I can point to one of the earliest examples that I could think of was during induction, which is the sort of pre-institute sort of welcome week kind of thing in the summer, that they had representatives from Parent Revolution there to meet with core members and brag about their work and things like that. And so for anybody who doesn't know what Parent Revolution is, they are a organization that focuses very heavily on what are called parent trigger laws in California.
Yes.
That are basically designed to let schools be transformed, quote unquote is the language they would use, but taken over and turned into a charter school. So taking a traditional neighborhood public school, closing it down, getting rid of the staff, and then turning it over to a charter provider. So within the first week of Teach for America, being with them, we have these representatives from this organization there. And that's something that consistently was seen throughout my experience with Teach for America. In Los Angeles, the overwhelming majority, I believe it's somewhere about 90% of Teach for America core members are placed into charter schools. In my special education cohort, that number was somewhere around 75% of us were placed into charter schools.
Wow.
And and then throughout there were lots of things that were done to tacitly, if not directly, support charter schools and school choice movements. But we were never offered any sort of counter or critique to those movements. We'd be sent out email blasts to encourage us to participate in the March for School Choice in celebration of School Choice Week. But if you wanted to talk about the detrimental effects of charter schools at professional development, you would be told that this isn't the place for that. So it was a very one-sided message that we would get in terms of charter schools. And then after that, you also see, a lot of my peers who I was with in Teach for America are now administrators in charter school networks or continue to work for charter school networks. And so once they leave Teach for America, they often, at least from what I saw, a lot of the people who do stay in education tend to stay in these charter school networks or tend to move into charter school networks. And so when Teach for America talks about the numbers of core members who are remaining in education, I don't know the numbers, but I would be very interested to see what percentage of those people that stay in education and teaching or administration are doing that at the charter school sites as opposed to, traditional neighborhood public schools.
Well, I find this really interesting. We are on episode 14 now. And no one has really made this exact point, which is that Teach for America, when you see the inner workings and you're a core member, that you have this, that they're proponents for school choice. I don't think anyone has underscored that point. Now, why I find your comment about the fact that you didn't see a balance in the conversation, actually find that a little bit ironic, because Teach for America, when we have conferences and meetings, oftentimes they will contact us and say, well, we would like a seat on the platform because we want there to be balance in the conversation. And thinking back, it's rare. I can't even think, off the top of my head, I can't think of a time where Teach for America allowed critique in any of their public forums, whether it be Gary Rubenstein, who talked about this, or Jameson Brewer, or Amber Kim, or any of the very prominent Teach for America alums who have very important critiques of the organization and the way it functions. But yet Teacher America wants their perspective to be privileged whenever there are other public conversations, but yet when it comes to their public conversations, they don't offer that same opportunity. So I find that comment that you just made, that the conversation is one-sided within Teacher America's communications, to be quite interesting. Is that what you found, Jameson, when you were in the Corps?
Yeah, absolutely. There were times that I would raise questions, and so really for me, the moment where I became disenchanted with Teach for America was the introduction of the academic impact model, this idea that Maslow's hierarchy of needs doesn't matter whether a student ate that morning or is living in poverty. None of it matters, and they're all excuses. You know, if you're just a good enough teacher, you're going to overcome all of that. And I sort of started raising questions, and like Ian said, they often will present this idea that they're open to conversation, open to a dialogue, but I found myself being pulled aside, being questioned, being put into a room where we were supposed to have this conversation, but what it really was sort of a group session to fix me and fix my thinking. Yeah, Teach for America, they very much have a single and one-sided message. Even at the most recent, the 25th anniversary summit, in the exhibit hall, this massive hall, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of booths set up. The vast majority of them were charter schools, and not just single charter, but KIPP was there, but different versions of KIPP and different KIPP schools were there. And not only were they handing out their information, they were doing interviews and recruiting people to come to the charter schools. I didn't see a booth for any type of different discourse or counter narrative whatsoever. Of course, the critics, we did have a brunch on the very last day in literally the very back room, but that was on the periphery, right? So in my experience, I agree with Ian that anytime that there is a conversational or critique that doesn't align with Teach for America's message, it's squashed or it's relegated to the margins. They try to explain it away, and if they can't explain it away, they resort to personal attacks on the people who are raising those questions.
And if I could just add one more point to that, to what both you, Julian, and Jameson are saying, which is that my experience also, showed me at least that I was always sort of presented with this false dichotomy in terms of thinking about what education reform means and what pushing for more equitable education means, in that it was either you were for progress, which to Teach for America meant charter schools, privatization, all of these things, or you were for failing public schools, you were for the status quo. There was no other possible opinion that one could hold. It was either you were pro-charter, and that means progress, or you were for the exact same thing that's going on, and you want no change and no progress to be made.
I think that's, in Teach for America, my interactions with some of the true believers, I've found that just personally to be true. I think you also see that in conversations with other education reformers too, whether they be from the Black Alliance for Educational Options or the Democrats for Education Reform. That's a very common argument that you hear. I think part of the challenge for those folks that are critiquing Teach for America, critiquing charter schools, is that we haven't really done a very good job talking about sort of this alternative, community-based, democratically controlled vision. Because essentially what Teach for America is they're a private provision of teachers to communities. They come to communities, they sign a contract, and then they decide which teachers are coming to your community, and you pick from the teachers that they decide. So it's external to that community. But there's all sorts of really interesting collaborations now occurring with colleges of education and school districts. Many examples of this, even at UT Austin, where Dr. Paisley is, where you teaches, you see those types of collaborations. But I think it's talking to the public about that Teach for America and many of their allies are often talking about all these private control and privatization approaches that are less democratic. But I think we also need to do a better job when we're talking with the Teach for America folks, not to be painted in a corner that we support this long-standing structural racism that has occurred in our schools, where the nicer house you buy, the nicer public school you get. But we are actually wanting to protect the rights of those children and protect the democratic process and the public having control of the resources in their schools. So I think that that's a very common argument. And we need to articulate a vision to Teach for America supporters and others that says that the private control and privatization of our schools is not the only approach to education reform.
What I'm thinking is in terms of, we talk a lot about classism and racism, but there's also a term called ableism that we're assuming that, as Ian said, everybody is going to fit into a one-size-fits-all model. And that's one of the pluses of what happens in a traditional teacher education program, and that is situations like finding out what types of learning preferences a student has. How do they demonstrate what they know? Does it have to be a paper and pencil test? Can we figure out other ways that students can represent what they know, or how we present the information? And it sounds to me like what Ian is saying and what is going on in this entire approach is that everybody is going to fit into this mold and into this way of teaching and this way of learning and demonstrating what they do and what they know. And if it differs or deviates from that, then it's not accepted. It's almost like we're taking what you're talking about. If you don't talk about charter schools and do it this way, then there's no dichotomy, you can't talk about the other. And we're kind of talking about, that's kind of what special education is all about, is if you don't fit into the norm, if you don't fit into what we're talking about, then you must be aside from the norm. You must not have the same ability. You must not be capable. And that is not what special education, and that is certainly not a civil rights moment or social justice approach.
Well, I think what's really interesting about what you just said, Dr. Pazey, is really a wow moment for me, because essentially what I took away from your comment is maybe Teach for America's culture is inconsistent with the differentiation that's necessary in special education. Because Teach for America, whether you look at their disciplinary approaches, you look across what they try to do, is they often use standardized models, right? And so if as you're talking about, the differentiation, how special education children have often vastly different needs, and then that runs into this charter school network and Teach for America teachers who have had very little training, and they have these sort of standard models that they're applying, that to me seems to mean that Teach for America's culture is inconsistent with special education.
Well, I would also say it's inconsistent with education in general education, because it's not just differentiation for students that might have different needs, but many students might not even be identified or seen as, quote, different or differently abled if they had an opportunity to have multiple ways of learning or multiple ways of how something is presented to them. So in a way, it extends even beyond special education. It extends into situations like best practice, specifically what we know to be good teaching.
I would take it a step further to say that it's not just inconsistent with education, but that it's harmful to special education.
Right.
And so what I mean by that is, so looking at the area where I taught, I was an inclusion specialist. I worked at a school that had full inclusion. And if you look at the literature on when inclusion works, number one, it requires a lot of training to do right, to co-teach, to do all these things. It requires a lot of training. So going in with zero training, you're already at a disadvantage. But when you look at the perceptions of general education teachers towards special education, and especially towards inclusive special education, one of the things you see is that a lot of those attitudes of general education teachers are tied to their perceived competence of the special education teacher. Do they feel that it's a fruitful and productive relationship? Do they feel that this is benefiting their classroom? And when you have untrained special education teachers sort of haphazardly running inclusive education models, it's going to have a detrimental effect on these views of inclusion. And in the disability rights community, and in fighting these issues of ableism that exist in schools and in society, one of the things we want is we want more inclusive spaces. And so the more we're kind of allowing, these situations and these environments to persist where we're not giving inclusion the best possible opportunity to be successful, could lead to further resegregation of students with disabilities in public schools, which would just be horrible.
We have a new piece coming out in the Stanford Law and Policy Review where actually we look at the segregation of English language learners and special ed kids in charter schools and other special populations, and find that it turns out that there's, when you do geospatial analyses, the access and segregation also by race and ethnicity is very problematic. If you look at the average numbers for charter schools across states, they look quite similar. But when you drill down to locality, that's where you can really see that segregation and lack of access. So it's, you were just talking about sort of the impact of Teach for America on special education students. And recently the What Works Clearinghouse released a review of 7 studies of Teach for America. Now, it was sent to me by a couple of folks, and I thought to myself, why haven't I seen Teach for America talking about this all over the place? Why hasn't the media been covering how Teach for America performed in this meta-analysis of studies, a study of studies? Well, it turns out because Teach for America only performs strongly in mathematics. In other areas, they found some modest impact in science, but in all the other areas, they didn't have a positive impact. And that is a study of studies. And last year, when I was looking at, maybe it was 2 years ago, when the Mathematica study came out and had a similar finding on math, I went and I looked at how many teachers in Houston, Teach for America teachers actually taught mathematics, and it was lower than 10%. So a full 90% of Teach for America teachers, you could extrapolate, are not having a positive impact if their impact is restricted to math and maybe science. So what do you think about that?
Well, one of the largest percentages of students that are admitted to special education are students with specific learning disabilities, and particularly in areas related to literacy, reading and writing, and also just being able to receive the information and make sense out of it. And so my question would be, math is a little bit different. There are students that might have a disability in mathematics. However, the literacy piece crosses across all aspects. And so my question would be, what types of training does a Teach for America person, Ian, have in regards to how to work with students in specific areas of literacy, reading, and also organizational skills and the ability to generalize what they're learning to other situations?
So I think I can answer that in 3 parts, which is first to think about, what sort of training in these areas did I receive from Teach for America? And the answer to that would be pretty much none. When we met for professional developments that were Teach for America led, it was, mostly focused on this idea of leadership development, because everybody from day one was a leader, and that was just the assumption. And so that was a lot of what the Teach for America training, sort of provided. At the university where I received my credential and master's in special education, that was a different story. We were presented with instruction on universal design for learning and differentiation and legal requirements of special education and IEPs and the IDEA and all of these different things. Now, taking that and then applying it to a one-size-fits-all charter school is a different story, but we did receive that, at least in my experience, at the university. But then the third piece that I would think of too is, what training is general education math teachers receiving in supporting and differentiating for students with disabilities in their general education classroom? And so that is another area that doesn't really get talked about when we're having these conversations about special education and Teach for America, is not just those of us, but when we're thinking about, approximately 90% of Teach for America teachers in LA are going into charter schools, and charter schools are more likely to have these one-size-fits-all approaches to special education. That means that 90% of the core members are going to have students with disabilities in their classroom, even if they're a general education teacher, because these are all full inclusion models. Mm-hmm. And so another thing that we're overlooking when we talk about this is that these general education teachers are not receiving any training, let alone, at least we get something from the university working through the program over the course of the next year or two. Those general education teachers, I believe, maybe receive a class, if that, and that's the extent of their training. But they're going to be having every single student with a disability and an IEP pass through their door at some point through the year.
One of the interesting things that I picked up on was your conversation about how Teach for America wants to train leaders. Now, we know that Teach for America only asks for 2-year commitments. In conversations with them over the years, they've said they're not interested in longer commitments for their teachers, for the folks that they're sending into schools, because they're leaders. And you talked about how your former colleagues were going and leading charter schools and doing a variety of other things. Well, I noted that at the Congressional Black Caucus meeting that occurred in D.C., that Teach for America had their leaders of color, their young folks that have left the classroom in D.C. talking with the Congressional Black Caucus. Now, one of the interesting things about this is that Teach for America over the last couple of years has really focused on bringing people of color into the core. Now, but let's think this through. So if they're more interested in creating leaders than teachers, then they're not actually addressing the shortage of teachers of color in the schools and public schools, hard to staff schools, right?
Well, what is Teach for America really trying to do here? Are they trying to allow individuals to learn a skill, or are they trying to provide an experience for someone that can then be taken into the policy arena or to the arena of public opinion? And I would say it's more about trying to provide an experience than it is about trying to learn a skill. And I think that's why you see a lot of, very single-mindedness, a high level of control over the experience that core members have. And that's why when core members try to critique or speak out or state a problem, they're kind of pushed off to the margins. I think mostly because they don't want a criticism to taint the experience that they're trying to provide to everybody else. They're trying to take everyone on a tour through these schools in a very sort of set up, sanitized way that aligns with what they believe the fix is, which is, market-based education reform and all of these things that we know have detrimental impacts. In that way, it sort of becomes, legitimizing. I was a Pell Grant student going to my undergrad, and Teach for America likes to make a big deal about the number of Pell Grant students that they are now admitting to the core. They like to use those of us who had economic disadvantages or whatever growing up when it suits their purpose, but when it doesn't, then we're not as valuable.
Yeah, I think it's a good point, right? So, Teach for America, and they've said it, and Julian said it too, that they are not a teacher preparation organization, they're a leadership preparation organization, right? And so having the core member be in the classroom for 2 years, right, it sort of gives some validity and justification for them moving into leadership positions within the school, whether that's the principal or if they're being elected as school board leaders or other government roles, or they're working at the Department of Education, or they're working in the Capitol building, right, for senators, right? It's this whole idea of they somehow become expertise or experts in education policy, right? It's a manufactured expertise that they now somehow have all of the answers for education policy because, you know, they went and slummed it for 2 years in some other community, in some school, and that somehow validates and justifies their position on education policy, which more often than not tends to take a very market-oriented approach to reform. It's one thing to have conversations about the impact that 18 hours or 2.5 days of student teaching might have on somebody's ability to be a teacher, but when you're receiving absolutely no training or very little training in special education, that should be very troubling for folks. And I think that in the past few years that Teach for America said that they want to be intentional about listening to critique and making changes. I think a way for them to do that would be to immediately create a moratorium on placing core members into special education positions.
At the very least, if there's not at least one full semester being provided, which we know doesn't even exist, then I would say that Teach for America has no place placing special education teachers into the classroom.
What I would say is that charter schools, when it comes to special education, are doing the opposite of what they say they're going to do, which is provide choice to parents. They're doing this one-size-fits-all, for the most part, approach to special education. There's not really very many opportunities for meaningful differentiation, meaningful access to different least restrictive environments, and it's presented to parents as this take it or leave it sort of offer. If we're talking about the whole purpose behind this push for charter schools is to provide choice for parents, then that has to be a meaningful choice for parents at the school level, not just whether or not I want to enroll my child at whatever charter school and take whatever it is they decide they want to offer. Charter schools are not exempt from providing what is legally required of all public schools under the IDEA, and as long as they continue to approach special education in this way, they are acting against the stated mission of why charter schools were supposed to exist in the first place.